Okay, so what I want to do is this is chapter one. Want to walk through the slides. We covered this in class, but I wanted to kind of go through, a quick um, run through that you can leverage as we're going through, kind of preparing for exam one. Um, from a starting point, the talk about as we're looking at this stuff, there's a question of the why of why do we use computing? Why is computing so important in business these days? And from a starting point, you know, companies operate in a competitive environment. So basically, this is not anything new, but what's happening is the means by which organizations compete and react and respond has really changed. Actually, it's becoming the timelines are shrinking. You know, the ideas of competitive advantages that organizations may have are not as defensible as they used to be. So as you see kind of an example here, Polaroid and FANG, which stands for Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. Polaroid, if you go back in the day, Polaroid was kind of like what those organizations were. And as we roll forward, um, you kind of look at what we have with FANG. Could any of those organizations, could Facebook or Amazon, at some point become what Polaroid is? And that's a possibility because things change. Right. So companies must continually define their business strategies to establish a competitive advantage and to define, maintain, and sustain their advantage. And then things change. So it's a moving target. So the idea of information systems, what we're seeing now with information systems, what we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years, is that really the information systems are really the key business enablers. There's there's a set of businesses, like for example, we use Netflix, which is totally built around technology. But then we've got other organizations, basically, more traditional organizations, which have really moved into and are leveraging it really as part of their overall portfolio, changing how they interact with suppliers, changing how they interact with customers. So, kind of the example, I think the classic example as we talk about, what happens with changing environments would be the story of Blockbuster. Blockbuster started up in '87. It was actually, was very successful. Their focus was on renting videotapes. Um, very successful, very profitable. '97, um, Netflix was started. Basically, the motivation for Netflix was uh, it was really over a late fee for a movie, right? So for Apollo 13, you know, Netflix basically started as a DVD uh, trading company who basically handled DVDs and really kind of took away some of the stuff that was used to annoy people about blockbusters, due dates, late fees, things of that nature. But they were, it was physical stuff. What happened with Netflix is Netflix, kind of created the model that really put um, Blockbuster on the outs, and then as Netflix had its rose in its ascendancy, it actually reinvented its own model and moved everything from moving physical pieces of DVDs to a streaming model. So they actually reinvented, uh, the market. They were ahead, established, really defined kind of what modern modern home entertainment. So So this is, so we see different organizations. Obviously, a lot of organizations are not quite as extreme as what Netflix has done, but we see this as we talk about this, as it's like these have really kind of have looked at using information systems as a means of um, establishing and enhancing their competitive positions. So, this is actually relatively recent. All right. We live in, I guess, what we would call the information age. And we compete in the information age. So, present time, basically, seemingly infinite quantities of information can be, it really is at our fingertips. But it's not that long ago. So actually, the World Wide Web only came online in '91. So we're talking about something that's not quite 30 years old. Actually, about maybe, um, I guess, maybe another 2 years or so, or 3 years or so. But it'll hit 30. But it's not a long, uh, necessarily long period of time. But it has you can divide the word into your world into the before and the after of the web. What we're seeing is, I guess, from the business side, in this idea of competition, organizations doing competition, is you're seeing, you know, organizations used to describe their mission statements as really from a business focus. All right, so if you look at well, Amazon started as a bookseller. All right, Netflix was, you know, renting videos, DVDs. Zappos was selling shoes. Facebook was getting people to connect. Tesla's electric car company, batteries. Um, but every one of these things uses technology. So they have a core business focus that is realized and maintained and sustained through the use of information technology. So the idea of using it to compete is kind of is the thought we're thinking about here. I'm talking around this idea of the profitability of organizations, and this is actually from '92 to 2006. So this actually kind of covers the information age. If we use the startup of the web as that, so you kind of see organizations have different profitability. So we got a kind of a mix of um, different types of organizations with different approach, with different business models, different markets, different customers. Right? The average industry, average in the industry for return on invested capital, which is you know, the metric that gets used for when most organizations are thinking about strategy. Um, it kind of strings out all over the place here. Right? But you'll see, every one of these organizations, are operating. Um, you see that like security brokers and dealers, very IT centered. Soft drinks not necessarily, by its nature. Prepackaged software obviously is. Pharmaceuticals, not quite so much. Right? So it's not necessarily a particular type of organization, um, that it automatically will benefit from it, but more that the use of information technology spans basically all organizations now. Right? It used to be certain organizations would be more focused on it. Now it's every organization. So the core drivers, the four, I mean, really data. So we live in the data age. So we talk about the information age. Right? There's really four attributes of as we talk about this. At the lowest level, we have data, which is basically facts, a collection of facts gathered. The thing about data is the three attributes of it: you generate data, you store data, you use data. Right? So it's very It's very granular. So it's like a piece of data would describe an event. Information is the product of analyzing data. Right? So if we're looking, if you turn this kind of list upside down, there's a hierarchy in which data is the foundation, information is created by data. Business intelligence is a further analysis of information to provide greater insights and more focus. And then knowledge um, is really a combination of a more enhanced being able to take what you have in terms of like business intelligence, combining it with experience or insights, and basically becoming you know a guidance for dealing with particular situations. Knowledge to date, knowledge historically, knowledge was always in the heads of people. Um, we're seeing the possibilities of you know what we call true artificial intelligence. Which really is the idea of being able to operate, be able to generate a programs, software that has the capability of using the same types of insights and thinking processes of people. Not there yet, all right, but at some point, there's a possibility that that could happen. Right? But this right here, this whole idea of data and the internet, really are the foundational pieces of what information technology has been about since '91, since the kind of the introduction of the web. So just a little quick description here. Data, raw facts describe the characteristics of an event. As you said, very granular, all right, individual events. So basically on January 4th, we had this sales rep uh, sold Walmart 41 bags of Doritos. With kind of an analysis or for that individual event. Right? If you take all of these events and kind of combine them together, we get meaningful. We add meaningful context to it, and so we add more context to it. So it's not just knowing individual events, but actually kind of doing combinations of aggregating information, consolidating information, summarizing information, comparing information, to be able to get answer questions. Right? Business intelligence, as we said, is kind of the next level up. So it can combine information. It can combine information. It's driven from business events, but can also pull information from all sorts of different kinds of sources. So both internal, external, and then looking at it to provide more answers or better answers. Right? You have to have a business strategy. You know, is plan of action. We define it, formal definition, plan of action to fulfill business goals. Um, in order to execute a strategy, you need to have information to make the best possible decisions to execute. So information doesn't set the strategy, but it helps. Basically, you need it in order to achieve the objectives you have set out in the strategy. Right. We kind of look at use an example here. We call it like predictive analytics. The idea of not just simply taking the data and figuring out what we did, but taking that information and then pushing it forward and being able to say, okay, based upon where we're at, what's the probability that if we introduce a new flavor of potato chip or a new type of sports drink, it would be successful. And just summary, this idea of knowledge, skills, experience, expertise, coupled with business information and intelligence. This is still kind of a people thing in large part, but it's what we're seeing more and more. It's people it's enabled with these other tools and this kind of analyzing data to information, information to knowledge, or and then to business intelligence, and then business intelligence to knowledge. So that it's this is the way a knowledge worker will be gather information that they can factor in as they look to establish or make decisions around situations. So that historically, most organizations would operate in kind of a functional silo. So each department, each would basically operate pretty much independent of other departments. Obviously, they all work in the same company. There's interconnection points, but for the most part, most organizations, for the longest while, were focused on functional. The idea of a functional silo. So accounting does accounting, and only accounting. I mean, they are heads down focused on accounting. Human resources is focused on the people side of things. Marketing is focused on message generation, supporting sales, things of that nature. All right. The information technology that supported this kind of model here was very functionally focused. All right. So the accounting department ran an accounting application. The marketing department ran a marketing support organization. The HR department ran an HR system. And each one of those applications ran independent. All right, so you had a, so we actually will have, we had, multiple applications kind of, focused on, particular functional areas, but all, basically all kind of working, in with to, implement the organization, basically to execute the organization's processes, and also to basically achieve the goals as laid out in the strategy. All right, so really what we saw was, and this really kind of started in the early 90s, and this is kind of reflects what we're doing today. From an organization perspective, what we've done is we've added and we've actually have these systems basically we call cross-functional integrated systems. So instead of an application only running, the accounting department, the information that we have in the accounting department is also, linked and organized and coordinated with the sales side, and the operations side, and the marketing side. So what we're seeing is one kind of a common application that has different functional components to it, but represents a consolidated view. So the idea of, in having this, the focus was really to kind of break up the silos rather than working independent, was basically working interdependent. Because what happens is the reality is, organizations, there's interdependencies at all these within each of these groups. All right, so the kind of the fact that they were separate was not necessarily, it really was kind of a suboptimal solution. So this idea of a interdependency, working interdependency, implemented through a software. In this case, the more noteworthy ones, SAP, Oracle. There's other ones that are out there of different, with different capabilities and kind of focused maybe in certain areas. But this idea of this MIS solution is, a common, every organization kind of pulling in, using a common set of systems, tying all these things together. So we talk around, kind of the way organizations are focused. So companies can do all sorts of things. So it's not only manufacturing, but there's some organizations that are focused on manufacturing. So what we do is they produce material, items, and goods for whoever organization that's in their market. All right. So the classic examples, cars, um, consumer goods like groceries, clothing, things of that nature, all manufactured Um, and then, conversely, what we also have is this idea of services, which are, we define that as tasks that people perform. People, uh, would, it's a service that is provided. Examples here: teaching or waiting tables or cutting hair. Those are all service oriented. Most organizations have combination, will have different combinations. You don't necessarily see, you know, organization only focused on, kind of the good side of things, or maybe services to a degree, maybe a little bit more. But you see a lot of times you have kind of a crossover between goods and services, to ultimately from an organization's execution. You know, these things are it's not a silo. It's actually kind of integrated. So kind of our when we talk around kind of what organizations do and how they operate. Um, Organizations, the operational side of organizations, are really centered around processes, business processes. And a process is really defined as a series of tasks that are organized to create an output that are executed in a particular sequence to give you a desired output. So the idea is you have an input, the process will take the input, do whatever, because the process can be anything, and then it will generate an output. I think the key issue with this is the repeatability. So the idea is, the expectation is that, you know, when you execute a process, you have, consistent input, consistent execution, consistent output on the other side. So when we have, if our expectation is that we're creating a hamburger, we don't end up with a hot dog or a pizza. Right? So this idea of processes is really, when we look at kind of the modern organizations think in terms of processes now. Was not always the case. A lot of, in long time, companies really kind of ran on, different metrics. So like, your return on investment, or your um, return on invested capital, or um, you know, overall sales. You know, and this was treated kind of as a black box. All right, the processes were black boxes. You didn't so much care. Uh, but as we started seeing the stuff, kind of pulling the stuff all together, um, and kind of integrating these things together, one of the things it became is that, processes, you kind of, the objective of a process is around optimization. It's how you can improve it. It's like you have continuous improvement. All right. So the idea of monitoring this, being able to process and gathering information. So one of the things we talked about ERP systems. One of the things that ERP systems do a really good job of, generates data. But what it does a really good job of is enabling you to monitor, get insights into what's happening within a process, and being able to track that and provide the type of metrics which can then be analyzed and used to adjust and realign the execution of a process. MIS, Management Information Systems. It is a business function um, focused on, it deals with information about people, products, processes across the organization. OLTP, we talk around, there's like two styles or two different types of applications that MIS, the Management Information Systems, deal with. One is what we call online transaction processing, which is really around, process execution and, optimal uh, execution. All right. So what happens is, a customer buys something, that end-to-end process is executed through an OLTP system. OLAP, on the other hand, is analytical processing. So one of the things, the OLTP systems are very, very, very focused on execution, execute, 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 execute. not that good for analysis. So this idea of an OLAP system, online analytical processing, is a kind of a new is relatively it came after OLTP. So it was kind of has matured over the past couple of years. So the idea is, the one system's OLTP generate data, which can then be moved into the OLAP system, which can be used to take that data, evolve it into information, take information, analyze it further with business intelligence, and provide an enabling capability um, for people in the organization. So, OLAP is, as we just said, analytics. So, the idea of gathering different kinds of information. So, we look at kind of the example. Tesla kind of is an interesting organization. Kind of what they did. It was the first, really the first new car manufacturer in 50 years. So it's 100-year-old business. Um, Kind of a couple things it focused on. This idea of self-driving cars, shared cars, zip cars. Um, this idea of you know basically adding compute capability into automobiles. It's done. We see more of that now, but the focus of this, especially with the kind of this is a the car as a technology platform. Um, the idea of enabling further innovations like Uber, Lyft, the idea of self-driving kind of moving along. You know, around this, um, the whole thing kind of around the planning, around the execution is driven by a lot of the analytics. So basically, looking at stuff and analyzing it, and then making decisions about where to go. So this is see we see and then this fact that we've got different types of data and different volumes of data and the ability to create, store, and use that data really is all the stuff that kind of drives what's happening in the OLAP sector right now. When we talk around big data is really like the next is very closely related to kind of this analytic processing. So the MIS department itself, kind of the how it's organized. You have a chief information officer. Basically, they is the oversees all of the uses of IT, establishes, and really is responsible for establishing strategic alignment of IT with the business. So, being able to take what the organization's mission statement is and then basically provide the enabling technologies and capability that would enable the organization to achieve its business goals and objectives. And there's a couple of other C roles that are associated with IT. So we call two out here: chief knowledge officer, which is relatively recent. This idea of data and data management and larger stuff. Privacy, which is now emerging as um, the significant area, especially with organizations with social media. The access to data, the generation of data, and how it can be accessed and how it can be leveraged. This idea of creating a chief privacy officer. The more common what we see in the roles is CIO is a very common. Chief technical officer is also basically somebody more. The CIO role is a business role, so the chief technology officer becomes more of the focused on the technical side of it. Uh, this chief information security officer is responsibility for security. So you've got a whole there's a couple different types of roles. Every organization kind of will establish kind of what it feels is appropriate for its own organization. In terms of, you know, its the IT leadership, or the MIS department leadership. As we said here, Chief Security Officer, responsible for ensuring security. Chief Technology Officer, kind of basically the mechanics of making um, the plumbing, the technical plumbing, do what it's supposed to do. So we talked a little bit before about this idea of a competitive advantage. It has always been around a long time. And it used to be organizations were very, they would focus on, what is the differentiator? How do they compete? And then, in that competition with other companies, competing in a marketplace, the idea of us identifying what is the advantage that you have against other organizations. So, the ability, and there's a couple different examples here of different things. It's not any one thing. Sometimes it's focused on cost. Sometimes it's focused on execution. So one advantage would be new products and services. So a good example of that would be like Apple. You know, re, basically, it's one of the things they have really focused on, being able to continue to um, release new generations and new capabilities in their products, on an ongoing basis. Maybe the ability to enter a new market. A lot of organizations are pretty well established, in their space, but the ability to kind of establish themselves. One of the things that we see is kind of establishing, leveraging technology. So one of the things about technology is it does provide some capability for a lot of organizations that to compete, at a with a lower profile, a lower cost structure against larger, more established organizations. Decreasing cost, I think the ones we see around that is Walmart, you know, and also to a degree Amazon. So I think Amazon is also an organization that is focused on kind of reducing cost and reducing cost. Attracting new customers is another competitive advantage, as well as the ability to drive sales. Right? So each one of these is in every organization, if you kind of take a look at it and focus on it, you get some thoughts around what do they do to make themselves successful. Right? So that's just kind of this, yeah. So the idea of the organization and kind of this in the world they live in. So you've got a whole bunch of stakeholders, all of which you have to deal with. So you start looking at this, you start getting a sense of all the players in this game. So from an organization, what you've got is at the one level you've got your customers. All right, what do you want to do? Your interactions with your customers. You also have your shareholders, who are the organizations, who owns the stock. One of the things you see a lot of organizations are focused on, and you'll actually see it called out, is, to enhance shareholder value. All right, so that's a pretty common, you know, definition or goal or objective that organizations will have. Organizations have partners and suppliers, basically the people who provide raw materials or services, enable them to do what they need to do. Um, Organizations have employees, obviously, dealing with that around, from a compensation, ethical treatment of employees, all of this stuff. These are all in play. Also, government, regulatory. Depending upon the organization you're in, there's a degree of regulation in virtually every company. Taxes, for example, but some are actually, much more heavily regulated than others. So if you look at pharmaceutical, or you look at chemicals, there's a lot of regulations associated with that. So these are all the players that an organization has to deal with. All these different, as we would call them, stakeholders that it kind of make up the world in which organizations are having they have to deal with this stuff. So as we just talked about competitive advantage, product or service organizations will place a greater value in similar offerings from a competitor, and it can take any form. All right, so some of the stuff we've seen with Apple, kind of Apple as an innovator of very high quality products, and then some other innovators, around FedEx, JetBlue. One of the things that's interesting is that this idea of a competitive advantage is not granted permanently. So it's not a permanent kind of thing. These things change. It's a very fluid, dynamic thing. It used to be a competitive advantage would be established with the idea if it would last for long periods of time. What we're seeing more and more and more is kind of a double-edged sword. Technology enables companies to become more competitive, but it also can make the environment itself more competitive. So the idea of the kind of the technology is a double-edged. It's a double-edged sword, and it's also it's an accelerator. In terms of from a business perspective. Talking around kind of the idea of a first mover advantage. First mover advantage basically means an organization that comes out first. All right, make a signal. If you can be first to market with a competitive, establish a position. One of the things that's interesting, first mover advantage was, and then was I guess a converse of this, or another approach would be like a fast follower. Sometimes this is a good thing. Sometimes this is an innovation. Can kind of move an organization ahead. But by the same token, other players in the same space can easily adapt, especially if anything dealing with technology. Technology continues to provide enabling capabilities. So sometimes your first mover advantage in tech, using technology is not particularly long, because other organizations can either copy it, replicate it, compete it, basically coming up with other approaches around it. All right. So that's the challenge that organizations have around, how do you deal with competitive advantages? And it's not a new thing. It's been around, but technology makes it different. All right. So we talk around kind of the this idea of a hyper competitive market, and some of the different things we see. Come to so this is actually probably within the past 30 years. And there's a couple different approaches and we'll talk about these. But it's not a matter of well, there's only one. Different approaches and techniques. Each one of these have particular advantages or strengths, and it's as good as the organization or the rigor that goes into using it. Really. But as we say here, in a dynamic, hyper-competitive, it's kind of our key word here. Hyper-competitive markets are advantages sustainable. All right, and that is, I think, that is the bajillion-dollar question for organizations. I think what they're finding is, the rate of change and things are, continue to become, change on an ongoing basis, pretty much more so than back pre-internet. So here's first when we talk around kind of a strength, weaknesses, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. The idea of kind of identifying, breaking the world into internal and external, helpful and harmful, and then kind of matching on this matrix. What are the organization's strengths? What are its weaknesses? Whether it's opportunities, whatever its threats. So the idea of looking, uh, trying to identify the things that have the most influence, that can work either for your advantage or potentially work against your advantage. Porter. Now, Porter, this is Michael Porter. The Porter we talk about here is Michael Porter. Um, and he actually did a lot of work around competitive theory. So he's got this, what he calls the five forces model. And if this looks a little bit familiar, it's very similar to what we had talked about, kind of the stakeholder model. All right, the idea of, and what he in Porter's analysis is basically, you the competitive world is made up of, the natural competitive, competition, existing competitors, people you deal with, go against every day, the people who are selling into the same space you go to, that you're trying to move into. And then there's what we call supplier power. So basically, the challenge of, your suppliers, that it would drive, could drive up control the price or influence the price of the materials that you need. Right? Buyer power, which is defined as the power of customers to drive down prices. So you kind of, you're calling you've got the natural, so you've got your natural organizational competitive competition, between your players, and then you got to deal with, your customers are trying to drive the price down, or have to put pressure to bring price down. Suppliers are operating to bring price up, and then you've got these two kind of outside threats: substitute products or services, and new entrants. All right, so this is, the substitute products and services. Um, it can be, a new product, a new approach to something. These are the types of things that, can blindside a company, because what happens is, you didn't expect something um, to show up, but it shows up. So if you look at, for example, uh, digital music, for example, CD manufacturers um, did not necessarily foresee the rise of digital music providers, right? And then digital music providers, conversely, the streaming became a kind of a new, substitution, or a new approach, a new means of doing things. So you see a whole bunch of stuff. A lot of this is enabled by technology, and then threats of new entrants into the market. A new competitor coming in, introducing, kind of, carving into the market. Sometimes they can be enabled by technology. Part of the way they're coming in is through, leveraging information technology to give them an angle or give them an edge that can let them be able to enter a market space and be competitive. So these are the five forces. You look at these five. You look at these five different elements here, and basically the world is a balance between all of these things, kind of going back, kind of back and forth. And the challenge for organizations is how to deal with all of these. How do you deal with suppliers? How do you deal with buyers? How do you deal with, keeping a watch out for substitute products and other people kind of coming into your space. So just quick, as we talked about buyer power, ability of buyers to affect the price of an item. So you get things like switching costs. You have loyalty programs. These are, from a buyer perspective, what organization looks to do is actually, a switching cost. Make the cost of changing from one place to the other significant enough that to prevent somebody from just simply moving across. Think of cell phones. Think of like the 2-year contract on a cell phone. So, not directly impactful, but if somebody else comes up with a phone and they want to move, they have to pay out the whole price of the phone. I think it's changing a bit, but that was kind of the thing that happened. So that was one controlling buyer impact, and then loyalty programs. You reward loyal customers. So things like frequent flyer, or uh, you get a free Subway sub if you eat 15 of them, or something of that nature. So supplier power, it's the ability of a supplier to change the prices they charge for supplies. All right, so you've got, you know, there's a um, some interesting, we've seen some interesting situations, especially like in the drug industry, where organizations are actually kind of going back and buying things up and kind of putting price pressure on. So all parties, organizations are focused on is being able to tie themselves to a customer, or excuse me, tie themselves to their supplier in such a fashion so they can control the cost, have a sufficient pressure to be able to either, supply the cost, or be in position to have multiple suppliers that they can, play off against each other, right? As we look at this whole sequence here, suppliers, company, and customers, this right here, this is something we call the supply chain. You'll hear this term gets used a lot. So it's really the end to end. So, supply chains is, suppliers supplying to a company, company providing to its customers. Right? So this reflects kind of the end to end stakeholders, and, with interactions occurring in between. Third are substitute products. It's high when there's a lot of alternatives. And low when there are few alternatives. Right? So the idea is being able to, establish yourself, in such a fashion so that people don't have other alternatives. Not that easy to do. So um, if it was easy, everybody would do it. And as we see, the life cycle, accelerating life cycles and increasing competition. These organizations are always looking for their opportunities to move into other markets, or from a defensive perspective, looking to see what other players might come into place. So this is an ongoing competitive, this is an ongoing situation for organizations. And finally, threats of new entrants. High when it's easy for competitors to enter a market, and low when there's significant entry barriers. Entry barrier being defined as a feature that people have come to expect, and being able to even enter the market, you have to have that sort of you have to have that capability, right? So the thing you see is the organizations, the idea of, I guess, more modern, or chemical bank with ATMs, which go back about maybe 40, 50 years, but mobile banking features. Basically, if you wanted to create your own bank, one of the things you'd have to you would have to make sure you created a mobile banking feature. It just simply would come part and parcel, because otherwise you couldn't move into that space. You would more than likely not be successful. So rather around, and this is the natural. This is I guess the kind of the natural, between existing companies. It's high when competition is fierce. So what you see now is like retail grocery, and it's low when competitors are more complacent. So you'll see things like this idea of product differentiation. What are the unique differences that you bake into a thing? Can you make it cheaper? Can you add features to it that would make it more desirable? Something that can separate you from other. Because the worst place you want to be is you don't want to be the commodity. The commodity folks, people who are selling commodity goods. There's no leverage at all. So what happens is the the sale price on that is just have multiple organizations they can or company customers can choose from multiple organizations, and there's nothing that really separates one from another. All right. So that's what you want to be able to, organizations are going to be motivated to develop some sort of differentiation of their product against others. So there's we talk about Porter, we were talking about Porter. So Porter has really been a thought leader in a lot of different areas. One area that he's done a lot of work in is this idea of creating a generic strategy. Basically his analysis, one of the things within his analysis was that basically there's only a couple different ways that companies will compete. Right? One is by cost. All right, so if you can establish a cost leadership position, that's an effective that's an effective strategy. All right. You know, differentiation is the other one. So it's either you're either going to give yourself a cost position, establish the way you make and go to market is cheaper. You can and then being able to sustain and keep your operation running while keeping your prices lower, or actually not just prices but also costs, manufacturing cost, and fully loaded cost, or differentiation. What new capabilities, what are the differentiators that people will be willing to pay for? All right, and just in a broad market, and then in a narrow market, kind of a more of a narrow focus. Porter said basically that your strategy is you focus. You know, what is the thing that you do best. Focus on particular areas where you have an advantage, and work to extend those advantages. Right? So this is his. This is kind of his. This idea within his model. Of the three generic strategies: cost, differentiation, focus. And then kind of the application of it under different circumstances. We're talking around. Here's kind of an example of some examples of organizations that kind of focus on this. So we'll talk around from a broad market. Walmart is particularly noteworthy for low cost. High cost is Neiman Marcus. So obviously, but they aim at different markets. All right. In a narrow market, pay less shoes. All right, would be kind of an example we would see, in retail space, and then from the higher end, Tiffany. All right. So there's different examples around kind of how this stuff gets applied. So this is a real, and this is a very real thing. Organizations, they focus on trying to understand where they sit vis-a-vis their competition. So another thing that Porter came up with, he's a very busy guy, so is this idea of a value chain. All right. So what this does is this kind of builds upon the idea of a business process. Business process, as we said, defined, standardized set of activities that accomplish a particular task. All right. And what value chain is, value chain actually looks at the organization as a series of business processes, and with the idea of everything, as you go through step by step within the process, each step should add value to the product or service. All right. So we look at our example here, under Porter, what we call Porter's value chain, is we have the primary value activities. All right. So this is right along the line here. So this is going to be, we've got, you got to receive and store raw materials. You got to make products. You got to deliver the product. You got to market and sell, and you get service after the sale. Every step as we kind of move from left to right, every step as we kind of move left to right, could be seen as adding value it's a more valuable attribute as we're moving through. Right? So this is what we call the primary. So this is kind of the primary value chain, and then everything else that a company has is described as support. All right, so for examples, the firm's infrastructure, all of the plants or all of the physical infrastructure that has to be established and maintained is a is part is considered part of a support value. Human resources is a supporting activity. Also technology, R&D, information technology, procurement. All these things are not directly in the value chain. All right, they're not primary value activities. They are support activities. Doesn't mean that they're not important. All right. But you look at these things and kind of qualify against, is it value adding or is it supporting? So what happens with this value chain model, the thing that's interesting about it provides kind of a mechanism for an organization to kind of establish leverages against some of these the five forces. So Porter kind of put kind of positioned the value chain as a means of allowing an organization to compete or to deal with the different five forces. So the two are kind of connected. So the idea of your supplier, procurement, supplier power, from a procurement perspective, buyer power, power the customers drive prices, substitute products, and entrance. So basically, it is really the ability for an organization to make adjustments within either the value chain or the supporting activity. So the idea of supporting activities, obviously, this stuff can be described as overhead. Can you reduce your overhead? To what degree can you reduce and be as efficient as possible with all of your overhead activities? All right, and then what do you need to do in terms of improving your value chain, either in terms of quality, performance, execution, whatever. All right. So that kind of brings us to the end of our first chapter. All right. So we're going to be talking more about competition, and we're going to talk more about kind of where this information system stuff comes into play. We'll see this value chain model represented in our next in our next area when we start talking about what is an ERP system and how the ERP systems work.